Hi, everyone, and welcome back to How the Wise One Grows. Before we get started, let's take a moment to land here together with 3 deep breaths. So just take a moment to notice where your body connects to the earth. You can gently soften your shoulders down your back. If it feels safe, you can rest your eyes. And notice where in the body you feel the inhale. And then notice where you feel the exhale. 2 more like this, noticing the in-breath. Notice the out-breath. 1 more, inhale. And exhale. Then return to where your body makes contact to the earth, and you can slowly open your eyes as you return to this space. So thank you so much for landing here with us. Today I am with Justine Carino. Did I say your name right? I meant to ask
Yes,
that.
you did. Yes.
Justine. I'm really excited to be with Justine today. Justine is a therapist, and we are going to talk about something that I have struggled with my whole life, which is people pleasing. So, Justine, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Holly. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored to be talking to you and your listeners and to be talking about one of my favorite topics that I am always talking about. I think so many people need to hear about.
I definitely agree. I kind of just want to dive in because I feel like there's just so much to this topic that's really relatable for I think a lot of people.
Right.
Do you mind just kind of leaning into sharing with us what people pleasing is? Because it's definitely a word people know, but what does it actually mean?
Sure. So the way we can view people pleasing is really our tendency to put in a lot of effort to make sure our actions and choices will be pleasing to other people. And
Mm,
this can be a subconscious way for us to try and guarantee a sense of security or acceptance or love from the people around us.
mm-hmm,
And I want to normalize this, right? I think people pleasing kind of feels good, right? And there's a
mm-hmm,
lot of benefit to it. And actually, we're kind of wired that way. Like, if we think about us being cave people or cave women back at the start of times, there was a lot of risk to not getting along with other people, right? So, from what we know, is like the women were together in like communities, right? And we learned from each other, right? We'd kind of gather and socialize. Well,
mm-hmm.
the males were the ones out hunting and providing and bringing back the food, right? So as females back in time, there's a lot of benefit to forming community around us, and that's kind of how we learned and exchanged information. Like, I'm imagining them sitting around a campfire, like, how'd you cook your chicken today? Oh, don't eat
Mm-hmm.
those berries. Oh, this is great fur to keep your babies warm. Like, we needed to socialize and be accepted for survival reasons. Like,
Mm-hmm.
the people that were alone probably didn't survive, right? But the people that learned how to make relationships and connections and a sense of community did. So if we look at people pleasing as a survival mechanism, if I could bring some happiness, joy, or please other people, I'm more likely to survive, which is so true if we even think of like babies today in 2023. Like, they want to please their caretakers because they're so dependent on their caretakers for survival. So making people happy is a survival skill. So people pleasing is a survival skill that we all have within us. So it's very normal. But when we have this conversation, I want to think of the excessive people pleasing, right? The people pleasing that we've become really dependent on and habitualized over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad that you leaned into like people pleasing isn't inherently a bad thing. It's truly like a survival thing for all people because if you didn't have community, you couldn't survive. And I think a lot about how I mean, it still is survival today, having community is so key, and especially on that emotional level in the world we
Yeah,
face. It really, the word belonging and like Brene Brown's work on belonging really comes to mind when we're
mhm.
talking about this right now.
For
But when
sure.
we,
For sure.
yeah, and when we think about that, I think of most things live on a spectrum, right? So there's like a spectrum where people pleasing can live, and it's like, yeah, that's how you belong and deal with community and can get along with people. But when we go to the other end of the spectrum that takes it to the extreme, and it can become detrimental to our own well being, I think that's where there's some work and more conversation to be had around it. So when we
For
think about
sure.
that end, yeah. And when we think about that end of the spectrum, I guess first, let me rewind this. How do people know if they're a people pleaser? Like, how do you, I feel like for me, I'm like, I know I'm one, but is it something most people know, or is it something you might not know?
Yeah. It's funny you bring that up. I remember, like, first of all, I identify as a people pleaser in recovery myself. But I
Mm-hmm.
remember like maybe learning the term at some point in like middle school and be like, oh my goodness, that's me. Like it had to be pointed out to me. I remember this moment
Mm,
and I'm like, yeah. So I wanted to learn all about it at the time. But like typical traits of someone that is a people pleaser is you say yes more than you really want to, right? You
mm-hmm.
tend to avoid conflict. You focus a lot of your attention, energy, and efforts towards being liked by other people. It feels like the end of the world if someone doesn't like you.
Mm-hmm.
Being unliked is very uncomfortable. Saying no also makes you uncomfortable or maybe even a little
Mm-hmm.
anxious. And it sometimes no comes with feelings of guilt that you struggle with.
Mm-hmm.
You often have too much on your plate or you feel resentful of all that you have to do or wish you could have said no. And you
Mm-hmm.
often hide your true feelings because you think it will make other people uncomfortable. If you really express what you're truly feeling, you're afraid you'll be rejected or make someone angry or have someone become disappointed with you.
Yeah. And why do you think that why do people fall into this pattern?
I think a few things. One of the biggest things that I talk about a lot with my clients is these people pleasing tendencies stemming from childhood family dynamics and going back to
Mm-hmm.
the survival mechanism inside all of us innately. Sometimes this is really necessary to survive in a certain family system. It keeps us feeling loved by the people around us.
Mm-hmm.
We say people pleasers were once parent pleasers. They knew what to do to please their parents, right? Also, like a fear of abandonment is there. Dynamics between parents and children can sometimes lead to this. Were you made to feel guilty if you did what pleased yourself over pleasing your parent or pleasing your
Mm-hmm.
sibling or pleasing what was good for the entire family system at the time? So I think this is developed slowly.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of benefit to those thoughts and behaviors in childhood that it then gets carried into adulthood. And adulthood is really the first time we recognize, like, maybe this type of being isn't so healthy for me.
Yeah.
And then we're resentful and like, why do I feel so resentful? But I think that a lot has to do with like early relationships in our life and how people pleasing benefited us.
Mm-hmm. And I think about like within a family, when I think about like me and my siblings, I feel like we're all on a different place on that spectrum. So is it kind of more, it's not necessarily about like, I always find it interesting how each child can have a totally different experience in a family system.
Yes.
So it's more like how you're situating yourself in that greater part of a whole versus just the way your parents like reared you and brought you up. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly, exactly. So we all take on a role in our family without anyone really knowing it, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so these are subconscious roles that we kind of fall into based on our birth order, based on how we show up when shit goes down in our family,
Mm-hmm.
based on like our own temperaments and needs, right? And I'm thinking of like me and my brother, like we're so opposite. Like, I'm more of a people pleaser. He's like, I'll do what I want and I don't care how you feel about it, right? And like, he's so
Mm-hmm.
assertive with what his needs are, where I was always more
Yeah.
passive. That was probably a great balance for my parents to have, right? We just fell into that. But these subconscious roles really keep the homeostasis of a system going.
Mm.
And so we kind of always play out these roles. And then when we head to adulthood, we then reenact these roles in other parts of our life. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, there could be 5 siblings in a family and everyone talk about their childhood in such different ways based on birth order and experiences at that time and the roles they filled that really benefited the overall good of the family, even if it
Mm-hmm.
was dysfunctional.
Yeah. From your experience, have you noticed a pattern in birth order in people pleasers?
Ooh, that's a great question. Um, Typically the firstborn is like, it could go a few ways, but I would, and I don't want to like stereotype or generalize, but typically the firstborn really wants to please. Like, they're the first and they like, the parents, it's like their guinea pig child, right? And they don't know
Mm-hmm.
what they're doing. And the firstborn kind of plays into that and really wants to please them. Where like the second or third child tends to be more of like the rebel.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also situations where the people pleaser is the middle child because
That's me.
that's you, right? So then we have, you're in the middle, and the oldest is kind of just being the pioneer of the family, like the
Mm-hmm.
first to drive, the first to have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or the first to maybe come out to the family, right? The first
Mm-hmm.
to do all of these things. And the other siblings kind of have to watch, oh, how's that going for that person? Do I need to, is that going
Mm-hmm.
well for them? Right. And then if you're the middle child and you have someone younger than you, then there's like the baby. And the baby tends to get everything earlier than the rest. The baby tends to be like the princess or the prince of the family, and they
Mm-hmm.
have their needs. So the middle child is kind of cut in two of like, how do I make myself known? I'm having a hard time doing it. So I'll just be the peacemaker. I'll just go with the flow. I'll shove my needs down. I'll please older sibling. I'll please younger sibling. I'll please the parents. Let me
Mm-hmm.
stay quiet with my needs. Everyone else has all of these other needs.
Yes,
So
I
I'd say
so
the middle
relate to
child
that.
too.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
rough being a middle child.
Yes.
My mom and I had like a going joke when I was growing up where I'd just be like, "What am I, chopped liver?" She
Right.
like taught me to
What
say that.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
really cute. I love that.
Yeah. So you mentioned a few things that I know I've experienced, particularly like burnout as a symptom, or not burnout,
Mm-hmm.
particularly resentment as a
Yes.
symptom of people pleasing.
Yep.
Are there any other kind of like side effects of people pleasing that you like people can be like, oh, maybe I am people pleasing more than I'm aware of? And do you notice any impacts of people pleasing on mental health and well-being?
For sure. So I think some like side effects or symptoms is people, and I love this question because people don't call me for therapy and they're like, hey, I want to come and work on my people pleasing traits. Like that has never
Mm-hmm.
happened to me. But once
Yeah.
they get in my office, we learn that about them. But the things that they're
Mm-hmm.
calling for is like burnt out, right? Which we'll go into
Mm-hmm.
too. I'm stressed out all the time. I'm overwhelmed. I'm very frustrated with a relationship in my life. So it could be a relationship with a parent, a sibling, their own romantic relationship, their friends, their boss or colleagues, right? There's some level of frustration that their needs aren't getting met and they don't know how to express them. They tend to
Mm-hmm.
shove it down. And that's part of the people pleasing traits. They often say, like, I feel stuck or I feel really trapped in my situation. And realistically, the way to get out is probably to be more assertive, but they don't feel strong enough to do that. So they feel
Mm-hmm.
stuck and trapped. Also, I hear a lot of like, I'm living an inauthentic life. Like, where I am today and
Mm.
how I got here were not actually what I wanted for myself. A lot of the choices I've made that have led me to this moment were made to please other people, mom,
Mm-hmm.
dad, mentors, peer group, society, right? So they're usually very frustrated. Like, I'm not living the life I want to live. I feel so inauthentic. So that would I
Yeah.
say would be some of those thoughts and feelings. But in terms of mental health, there's a lot of anxiety and a lot of burnout that comes with people pleasing.
Yeah, I definitely, when I think back, like as a child, I would kind of get to a point with friendships where I would just be like, I can't hang out with that person anymore because maybe we weren't like hanging out in a way that was supportive for me, but I didn't know how to communicate it. Or if I didn't, I would just like ghost almost because I just didn't know how to be like, I actually don't want to do that today. Maybe we could do this instead.
Yeah, so I love that. That's like ghosting to avoid the possible confrontation that would
Mm-hmm.
need to happen. That's interesting. It's like so compensatory to that.
Yeah. This is something that a listener sent in, which I was like, did you get inside my brain when you came up with this question?
Yeah.
But they asked, when we're thinking about people pleasing, how can we find a balance between making people happy, which like for a people pleaser, like often I'm like, that makes me happy. Like, yeah, if you're happy, I'm happy versus over people pleasing. Like, how do we find the balance of when people pleasing is maybe like a healthy thing versus when it leans into that unhealthy place?
Like really doing too much for others? That's a great question. And I think it's like a constant assessment of your patterns, right? Your
Mm.
behaviors and how the choice makes you feel inside, right? Because I feel like it's little and big. A friend invites you to her 30th birthday party and you really don't want to go and you're dreading it, but you want to make the friend happy because you
Mm-hmm.
value the friendship and you know there's a
Mm-hmm.
benefit to doing. So we do have to please people sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes people expect that of us. And those are hard decisions to make because if you said no to everything everyone asks of you, then at some point we teeter on, are you being kind of selfish or are you
Yeah.
being kind, you know what I mean? Like we do have to accommodate other people's needs in our relationship. So it's really a gray area. And I love the listeners' questions because we don't want to think of it as rigid. We want to think of these decisions as fluid. And I think a lot of it has to do with what you value, right? So if you value this friendship that I'm making up in my mind of your friend's 30th birthday, like, is this a friend that would do the same for you, right? Would they
Mm-hmm.
support you? Um, do you think you would feel good once you were there? Do you value the years, how many years you guys have been friends? And if you weren't going to the party, you would just be sitting and watching Netflix. Maybe you could push yourself out of that bubble, right? It would be different if it's like, ooh, it's my friend's 30th birthday, but I'm 9 months pregnant, right? Then that's a different
Mm-hmm.
conversation. Well, I kind of value my rest right now. I value getting my sleep and I can imagine being out and I need to express that to my friend. Even though this might disappoint that friend to hear me say I'd rather sleep, maybe it's a little bit more understandable, right? You're about to give birth next week. So I think we have to kind of check in with our values in those moments because our values do change over time and we have to adapt to what we're valuing, what's a priority in our life. But it's a little bit of give and take because if we never please other people and just put our needs first all the time, then that's a tricky place to be in also. So we kind of have to constantly assess the balance. But it might
Mm-hmm.
be like another thing I'm thinking about as an example of burnout and people pleasing. Let's say you have a boss, and when you were hired, you were told the hours were 9 to 5, right? And then all of a sudden you're realizing 4 months in, you're not, it's not really 9 to 5. He calls you as soon as you get home, and then you're doing work in the evening. And it's Monday through Thursday, you're doing that. And now it's a mess. You're working so many more hours than you originally thought it would be. And now you resent your job and you're ready to quit and you're too afraid to have this conversation, right? So that's an example of like, wow, your people pleasing has gone too far. You need to stand up for yourself now and have a
Mm-hmm.
conversation with your boss and talk about, hey, I want to work here, but now you've taken advantage of my kindness and now I need some boundaries around my work hours. How can we talk
Mm-hmm.
about that? So I hope that answers the listener's question a little bit.
Yeah, there's a lot I want to dive into with that. When I first saw this listener question too, it made me think a lot about how I often find myself when I'm in situations with people. If I'm with someone where they're like, oh, well, what do you want to do? And my default is like, whatever you want to do. I've noticed this pattern of I am much more comfortable leaning into figuring out what someone else wants versus leaning into figuring out
Mm,
what I actually want,
I
you
love that.
know? Yeah, and so that's been a constant practice for me, is like tapping in and learning how to listen to like, what do I actually want right now? Because my default mode for so long has just been like, I'm assessing the people around me, trying to figure out their needs to make sure their needs are met, not even tuning into my own. So that's
Yeah,
where I think mindfulness has been really key for me, is just like taking a moment, slowing it down, listening, and embodying for me um, what's actually there.
that's
And then
such a great point.
yeah, is that something you see in people often, or?
Yeah, I mean, I just love how you gave such a solid example. Like, what do you want to eat for dinner tonight? It doesn't matter,
Mm-hmm.
you pick, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
what time should we leave in the morning to go on our trip? Doesn't matter, what's best for you. Like, the default
Mm-hmm.
is always what works for you, what works for you. And then they decide, and we may be too afraid to actually verbalize, well, I'd rather leave at this time, or I kind of want this for
Mm-hmm.
dinner tonight. And these are little examples, right? But they happen so much that it becomes problematic. All of a sudden, we're not making any decision.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I've found too that it'll be like people that I know are like supportive of me. It would be like in a situation with, I'd be so uncomfortable making anything inconvenient for someone, even if it's not even inconvenient. Like it would be like with my roommate who have lived with forever and, no issues there. And it'd be like, man, I'm out of lettuce and I really want to borrow some of hers, but I don't even like want to like text to ask that. So I'd rather just figure out another solution for myself. And it became a practice of like, okay, this is a moment where I notice like I don't want to do that thing, because I'd rather make myself go out of my way to do something versus like telling someone I need something as small as a handful of
Yeah,
lettuce. So letting those be my scaffolding to build up of like, okay, this is a relationship that I know is safe, that I know is supportive. This is a really small thing that like she's not even think twice about. So like those were my moments of practicing like, I'm going to name my need right now, and practicing those needs being met, and then like that can build and build. So when there's other things, it feels less overwhelming to name your need. But I think you
such
really have
good
to meet
advice.
yourself where you're at. Yeah. I
Such good
think the
advice.
baby steps go a long way when it comes to that.
For sure, for sure. And you're bringing up like the mindfulness check in. Like, what am I feeling right now? What is this need that I want to be met that's triggering me or I'm having a reaction to, which makes me think of like one of the best ways to try and overcome people pleasing is paying attention to your thought patterns that are involved with
Mm.
these behaviors of avoidance, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of what we call in psychology cognitive distortions. They're really like these thinking traps. And there's a lot of the shoulds, the musts, I ought to. We personalize things. We kind of jump to a conclusion without enough evidence. And with a lot of people pleasing thoughts and behaviors, we're jumping to a conclusion that if I say this or express my need, this person will be disappointed, or this person will reject me, this person will abandon me, this person will fight with me, this person, blah, blah, blah. And the reality is, like, probably not. Like, that person might just say, yeah, take my lettuce and not think
Mm-hmm.
anything of it, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of mental work the people pleaser has going on that we need to slow down with the mindfulness and do some thought checking. Are my thoughts even
Mm-hmm.
helpful? Are my thoughts even accurate? Is the way I'm thinking even reality based? So
I
I love
had a
that you bring that
moment
up.
with my husband the other night. We were at like a baby shower or something, and had been sitting with someone else, and then I was talking to him, but I'd left my drink, and I was like, like I leaned into him and was like, man, like, is it bad if I go and reach over to get my drink and then I'm not talking to them anymore? And he was just like, I have never met anyone who overthinks as much as that. And it's like, oh yeah, these are good checks. Like it's okay. You can get your drink.
You can get your drink.
Yeah,
It's
like you don't
so
have to feel
true.
rude about that. It's
Oh yeah.
okay.
Oh yeah. And that's so funny. And like my husband, I always joke like I'm the people pleaser and he doesn't appease anybody. And that's something
Mhm.
that maybe makes us a good fit, right? He's able to set boundaries so much better than me, the trained therapist, is able to do. Like it just
Mhm.
came natural to him to be able to do things like that. And he often is like the default of, ooh, like, can you set this boundary on our behalf? But, I should probably really practice it. But it's so true. Sometimes people pleasers partner up with people that are more assertive and able to set boundaries a lot better or get their needs met a lot easier.
Mhm. Definitely. So as we start to talk about boundaries, I feel like we've kind of like dabbled in this. But how do you work with people to start establishing boundaries and kind of dealing with that initial discomfort of like now we're able to notice like okay, this pattern might be unhealthy for me with this point, I need to start to adjust. Where do we start and how do we deal with like the uneasiness that can come with that?
Totally. And I think boundary setting is another great way, besides the thought challenging, to help with people pleasing, because people pleasers tend to have a little bit more elusive boundaries, right? We can think of boundaries as rigid or loose or a little flexible. Like there's different ways to describe it, but the people pleaser tends to be kind of loose because the setting the boundary leads to fear that the person will be disappointed with my boundary, right? So we want the people pleaser to start
Mm.
practicing setting more boundaries. So it really feels uncomfortable to start this if you're someone that's the people pleaser, because you're not used to doing it. But just because it's uncomfortable doesn't mean it's bad for you. This is a good discomfort for you to go through.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like boundary setting, we've really simplified online, but it's truly so complicated. And we want to imagine a boundary being this imaginary line that separates me from you, right? People have physical boundaries, which is a little bit more easily understood, but we also have these emotional boundaries, relationship boundaries, boundaries with our time and energy, our needs, our responsibilities from others. And our boundaries also tell other people how they can treat us and send a
Mm-hmm.
message about like what's really acceptable for us and what isn't. So people pleasers tend to be burnt out and they've ignored their boundary line somewhere, and it's usually with time, energy, or resources, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in order to start setting boundaries, we need to get very clear, going back to the values, right? Like, what are your current values right now? And that clarity can help you guide your decisions around how you're spending your time, what you're agreeing to do, what your priorities are, who are the people in your life that should take up space. And one way I try and challenge this in session is asking my client, like, do you value other people's comfort level over your own? And that sits with
Mm-hmm.
people for a while, because that's the truth. When we are people pleasing, we're saying, I value their comfort level and their happiness over what I need right now to be happy and comfortable. And you can't live a life that way. We need to value and honor our needs and what's truly good for us. So we want to challenge that over and over again. Like, what is the priority to you right now? And often we're stuck with decisions like, wow, I really value this thing and that thing. It feels impossible to make this decision. And that's real. That's life. There are so many situations where both values are being held, like friendship versus your husband, right? Oh, you value both of them, but now you have to pick one in this situation, right? Or let's say you have children, right? I have two little kids. Like, do I value her well-being right now or his well-being? How do I maintain two? Like, one's hitting the other, and how do I stop
Mm-hmm.
this fight, right? It's like constantly trying to assess that. But anyway, so when we get clear on like what we're valuing, and I have a lot of exercises I do with clients that have like a bunch of like 100 values already laid out. You're circling the ones that fit for you right now. We're ranking how important they are to you. That just gives you some clarity. Then you can set a boundary with the time that you spend with other people, your resources, what you're saying yes to. So, for example, I'll just use myself as a model. I'm a working mom and I love my career, but I also love time spent with my kids. And one of my biggest values is presence. So when I'm working with my clients, I am 100% focused on them, right? Like if it's in person or telehealth, how dare I check an email on a telehealth session? I would never do that, right? I'm your
Mm-hmm.
therapist. I'm 100% focused and present with you, actively listening, right? And but then when I go home, I want to do the same for my kids, right? I want to be 100% present with them. And how dare I check an email while I'm playing with magnet tiles, right? In a
Mm-hmm.
perfect world, we can do that 24/7. It's not a perfect world, right? Sometimes I have a client crisis where I do have to step outside my home to manage blah, blah, blah,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or vice versa. Maybe I am in a therapy session with a client and I'm like, I have a really important doctor that has to call me, that I have to step out for 5 minutes. Can you stay another 5 minutes if this call comes up? Blah, 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 right? So the value of being present has guided my boundaries, right? At work, I have boundaries to be present at work, and at home, I have boundaries put in place to be present at home. Does that make sense?
I think so. So, is what you're saying is that boundaries can be fluid, and that's like not
Yes,
necessarily a bad thing as long as they're in alignment with your values. And by using the
yes,
values as the base, the boundaries can kind of meld around that from moment to moment.
exactly. And listen, there's going to be some very rigid values people have. I mean, rigid
Mm-hmm.
boundaries people have, like, I will not allow you to physically harm me, right? These are
Yes.
easier ones, right? People have
Yes.
very rigid, strict boundaries, as we should. But then there's other boundaries that can be a little bit flexible. But knowing what you value can help set up the boundaries that you need. And when we are in alignment with that, it's easier to set the boundary because you know it's coming from a place of alignment. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's a little easier to talk to someone and say no when we're saying no out of our value system of what we value right then and there. So it's hard to do. Like I always recommend, like we start slow, right? Like what's
Mm-hmm.
one small thing that's kind of insignificant but will give you good practice to set a boundary around? And it could be with
Mm-hmm.
yourself or another person. And once you're consistent with practicing that, let's try a different boundary to set. And we want to slowly build on that.
Yeah, I love that. I think for me, a huge starting point was setting boundaries with myself, of being like, these are my non negotiables of ways I'm going to care for myself every day so that I can show up and not hit that resentment and burnout, and getting like really clear on that and really practiced in that. So then, if I wasn't at a point where I could communicate my needs as much as I wanted to. It was like I've taken care of my container enough to be in this space, and I've like done that base first. Like I put my
Mm-hmm.
oxygen mask on first, and then
Yeah.
it's built and built. But I remember I mean, even sometimes now I probably still do it, but there was certainly a point where like I would want to go on a run or meditate or do something, but like I knew someone else wanted me to do something else, and I would, instead of saying like, no, I need to do this for myself because I thought it was like selfish, I would like make up another reason I couldn't be there or something or other. But versus, I think
Yeah.
it's important to view, someone once told me of thinking of it as selfish with a capital S, and it's like not a bad thing to be selfish.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes there's a
Mm-hmm.
beauty to it, and it's like a radical compassion and radical acceptance to be like, no, this is what I need right now. I need to tend to me on this very baseline human level of having my basic needs met. Then I can show up and be a human with you and engage with you. But if I don't do that first,
Exactly.
I can't do the rest. Yeah.
Yes. And correct, trying to work on the people pleasing and setting boundaries is actually protective of the relationships we have because, as you were saying before, like you could end up ghosting and cutting someone out.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're practicing, like, oh, I want to speak up and get my needs met or balance or have a conversation or communicate of like what works for both of us, then you're actually feeding and nurturing this relationship and sustaining it longer than the avoidance and like cutting it off or running the other way.
Mm-hmm. And I think there might be a double-edged sword to this one too, particularly in, family dynamics and relationships you've had with people for a long time. When you start to make that shift of my default mode isn't just going to be people pleasing. I'm not just going to agree and do what you want me to do all the time the way you're used to. I think that's really hard for the relationships at first. And some
Yeah,
forever, some may never totally adjust to it, and that's information. Um, but in my experience, it's almost been like there's like an earthquake in the relationship, and like the foundation, the soil, it's like gotta get broken up to get rearranged to settle into this new dynamic. Um,
absolutely. Absolutely. And sometimes the family members or the friendships will act out and trying to suck you back into the way you were before to maintain that homeostasis of the relationship, of that predictability, that certainty of, oh, well, this person
mm-hmm,
always does things this way. But you're absolutely right. Some relationships can adapt to those new boundaries and others may not. But it's at the end of the day, you're going to be feeling better. This alleviates the anxiety, the guilt, the burnout for you.
mm-hmm. And maybe on a level you're not going to be feeling better too, because as a people pleaser, it's like when, oh, like you're mad at me now, my
Mhm.
system does not know how to deal with that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
having to learn how to be okay with that discomfort, because I think maybe this is where your values
Absolutely.
check comes back in. It's like
Hmm.
there's some serious discomfort that I'm feeling right now, but I'm checking into like my core value, not maybe this like ego that's in my head telling me that I need to do this to be loved.
Exactly. You hit it right there, right? It's whenever there's guilt, we want to check like, did I make a decision out of alignment with something I value? And most of the time, you're working on yourself. You're trying to make decisions out of your values and things that are in alignment with you. So the guilt can be irrational, and it's just tolerating like, oh, I feel so uneasy that this person's mad at me or disappointed them or I said no. But you get through that. And that's the growth,
Mm-hmm.
getting out of the comfort zone.
Yeah. And just that learning how to be with discomfort, I just think is like maybe some of the medicine of people pleasing.
Mm-hmm.
Like we just have to learn how to be with it. We have to learn how to be with the discomfort of knowing what you actually want and feeling worthy of that enough to name it. And the discomfort that arises when you don't please everyone, because you can never, you won't always. And it's more important that you're like tapping into your values and honoring your authenticity. Um, and I was thinking about this when we were talking about families too. This is maybe a way we can have a bit more compassion in these like more lifelong relationships we've had when they don't handle our new boundaries well. And like that's okay. Like if like I think something I've really had to learn is I am not responsible for how you receive my boundaries. And like I'm not
Yeah.
responsible for caring for you in that. Like that one's on
Yeah.
you. But I can have compassion, especially in like a family system where like we've all operated in this way to survive. This is how we have
Yeah.
made it. This is how we have formed. So when there is a disruption, it makes a lot of sense for people to like want to meld it back to the way it was, because that's what felt safe to them, even if it was dysfunctional or not supportive. And with healthy communication and like a lot of time and practice, it can remold. But I think it can be helpful from the people pleasing end to kind of see it as like maybe it's not about me, which often I think that's like another secret for people pleasers is like it's actually not about you as much as you think it
Yeah.
is.
Absolutely. I love that you brought that in, the compassion part. And I think what might feel good is like the people pleaser being able to call it out, like, hey, mom, like, I know I normally do this every Wednesday for you. I'm just making something up, but you know
Mm-hmm.
what? I can't anymore. And I know that's like so disappointing for you, but this is what it is going forward. I understand if you feel a certain way about it, right? And giving the other person the opportunity to react. They are going to react and they're going to react in a way
Mm-hmm.
that's uncomfortable. And that's that tolerance and validating that person. Like, yeah, mom, I see why you're upset about this change, but I need to make
Mm-hmm.
this change, or whoever we're setting that boundary with.
Yeah.
And that compassion is kind of reasonable. Yeah, you are changing and people don't like change, so they're going to react to
Mm-hmm.
it.
I'm thinking of it right now as my sister and brother-in-law are like new parents. They just seem like total rock star parents. And when their kid doesn't get what he wants sometimes, they don't like just give it to him. They just like look at him and they're like, it's okay to be upset, buddy. Like, it's okay to feel
Yeah.
sad. It's okay to feel frustrated. And I think it's kind of like repeating that to yourself sometimes, or like mentally saying that to the other person or verbally saying it like, it's okay to
Yes.
be frustrated by that. Like, I'm not going to change the boundary, but that's okay that you feel
Yes.
that way.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's also making me think, so there's a modality in therapy called internal family systems, and it's kind of
Love
like,
internal family
okay, so
systems.
you know, so there's the parts of
Mm-hmm.
ourselves. So the people pleaser might have a part called the pleaser, right? And so the pleaser has probably made a lot of decisions for them in their life that they've benefited from. And now if they're working on this, they might have to tell the pleaser and themselves, like, you're so well intentioned. I know you have my benefit in mind. Thank you for being here, but I need you to step back a little bit, pleaser, right? Or when you set a boundary and you're met with resistance, the pleaser in you are be like, oh, just change it back. Just change the boundary back. Let's
Mm-hmm.
make this person more comfortable. Like, oh, I can't take this discomfort. That's when you literally in your head talk to the pleaser part of you, like, pleaser, I know this is uncomfortable for you, but it's going to be okay. We can get through this. Kind of like talking to
Mm-hmm.
the toddler about the frustration.
Yeah. I think it's so helpful to just be able to view the different parts and just like imagine yourself self-soothing in that way, and just like being as compassionate to all of those parts, and like none of them are bad. They just are there. They're not always doing good
Yeah.
things, but the core of it
Yep.
isn't.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Do you know much about the Enneagram at all?
I don't, and I know, like, it sounds amazing and I hear a lot about it, but I don't know much about
Yeah, totally good. I was gonna see if there
it.
was a relation in that at all, but
That number and people pleasing, that'd be interesting.
yeah. Yeah. Um taking a moment to regroup regroup my brain because I let it get scattered.
Yeah,
Um
yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I think that this was all so helpful. I tend to like to leave listeners with one small step they can start to take after these conversations. So, do you have one small step you would advise someone take today to, if they identify with people pleasing, how can they work towards stepping out of that pattern?
Yes. I would say think about one thing you have been resenting lately.
Mm,
Maybe it's an obligation you agreed to do, or a chore you took on, or an assignment, or like something that you've been really resenting, a work hour, a work commitment, who knows, whatever it is. And let's use that as an opportunity to set a boundary. And that might say, telling your friend, you know what, I agreed to bring the balloons for your bridal shower. I'm just making something up. But you
mhm,
know, that day it's going to be really difficult for me to actually do it. And I keep thinking about this. It's better if someone else can take that task on, and I'm happy to do blah, blah, blah. Right? Like you kind of trade it out. Or
mhm,
it's, you know, I work every day till 6 o'clock. I told this client that I would see them at that time, but this time really I resent this time. I need to talk to this client about a different time that we can be meeting, right? So one thing you're
mhm,
resenting that you can set a boundary with and use your affirmations like, I can do this. I know this is
mhm,
uncomfortable. I can tolerate how uncomfortable this is. It's not going to be as bad as I think it is. Let me just try this out. Let me attempt this. So that would be your homework, listener, to pick one thing you're resenting, identify how to express that resentment in the most kind, compassionate way, and set a new boundary or say no or honor your own need in that situation.
Yeah, I love that. And I definitely recommend like starting small with that and then
Oh, yeah.
building. Like, don't start with your biggest thing. Start small and
You know,
then you'll feel better and want to do it again.
don't quit your job tomorrow. Let's pick
Yeah.
something else that we can do first.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. This is such an important topic, and I really think it's going to be supportive for so many people listening. For those who are listening, do you mind sharing how we can support you and the work that you're doing in the world?
Absolutely. So everything is on my website, carinocounseling.com. That's where you can find all my services. I'm a therapist in New York. So if you live in New York, we can do virtual therapy. If you're outside New York, I do anxiety coaching. I also have a podcast called Thoughts from the Couch that focuses a lot on anxiety management, relationships, people pleasing, and perfectionism. I also have a fun quiz called Which Type of People Pleaser Are You? Which, if you
Mm.
take it, you get assigned one of 5 like archetypes that I've come across in my work, and you'll get an email of that archetype and some of the things that that archetype struggles with. So I can definitely give you that link as well for show notes.
Awesome. I'll put all the links to Justine's things in the show notes. And I definitely recommend listening to Thoughts from the Couch. There's so many good conversations on there as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Holly, for having me.